The wind, a ghost of old gods, scoured the crags of the mountain pass, a constant, abrasive murmur against the thick glass of my observatory dome. Inside, the air was still, cool, a sanctuary of ordered hums and the soft glow of monitors. I, Seth Grant, lived by the rhythm of these machines, a solitary pulse beat against the universe's indifferent vastness. My days, and often my nights, were a meticulous dance of data streams and spectral analysis, a quiet communion with the echoes of creation. Every morning, the ritual began, a single cup of black coffee, precisely measured, sipped as I watched the first lines of cosmic microwave background data scroll across my primary display. It was the universe's oldest whisper, the residual heat from the Big Bang, a tapestry of ancient light that held secrets I was determined to unravel. For years, I had sifted through this celestial static, searching for the elegant imperfections, the gravitational lensing, the faint signatures of primordial events. My hands, stained faintly with toner and the ghost of old ink, moved with practiced precision across the console, calling up new datasets, calibrating sensors, chasing down the minutiae that others deemed noise. The solitude here, perched on this desolate mountain pass, was not a burden but a chosen state. The world below, with its clamor and superficialities, felt distant, irrelevant. Up here, under the naked, indifferent gaze of a billion stars, only the data mattered. It was a purity of purpose that few understood, a quiet obsession that had carved out the contours of my existence. My only companions were the spectral readouts and the occasional, fleeting shadow of a high-altitude raptor circling the peaks. Today, however, the familiar rhythm faltered. A subtle discord had begun to resonate within the symphony of cosmic noise. For weeks, it had been a flicker, a statistical outlier I dismissed as instrumental drift, a ghost in the machine. But it persisted, a stubborn numerical anomaly that defied every known calibration, every cross-referencing algorithm I threw at it. I'd spent countless hours, fueled by an uneasy curiosity, trying to isolate it, to categorize it, to make it conform to the established laws of physics. It refused. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the cool glass. The anomaly wasn't loud, not a sudden burst or a dramatic spike. Instead, it was an impossibly complex, evolving pattern woven into the very fabric of the CMB's thermal fluctuations. It was subtle, almost shy, but undeniably present, a persistent deviation from the expected Gaussian distribution of the background radiation. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a tremor of something akin to apprehension snaking through me. Show me the spectral decomposition, isolated to quadrant gamma 7, I murmured to the system, my voice a low rumble in the quiet room. The data shifted, coalescing into a more granular view. There it was again, a series of faint, harmonic oscillations, nested within each other, like an infinite set of cosmic Russian dolls. Each oscillation was distinct, yet flowed into the next with a terrifying mathematical elegance that spoke of design, not chance. This wasn't a random artifact. This wasn't a terrestrial interference. This wasn't even a known astrophysical phenomenon. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, found itself grappling with an unwelcome intruder. Every instinct, honed by years of rigorous scientific discipline, screamed that this was impossible. Yet, the data, cold and irrefutable, mocked my disbelief. I ran the analysis again, then a third time, routing the raw telemetry through an independent processing unit, bypassing my usual filters. The pattern remained, unwavering, a silent, insistent presence in the universe's oldest light. The air in the dome, usually a comfort, began to feel thin, charged with an unidentifiable energy. My initial scientific curiosity, a familiar engine, was morphing into something more visceral, a prickling sense of unease. This wasn't merely a breakthrough, it felt like an intrusion, a secret glimpse through a keyhole I had no right to peer through. My gaze drifted from the glowing screens to the vast, inky blackness beyond the dome, where countless stars glittered with an ancient, silent indifference. The anomaly pulsed on the screen, a silent question mark hanging in the cosmic ether. It was a language, perhaps, or a signature, utterly alien in its structure, yet undeniably coherent. I was standing at the precipice of something monumental, something that threatened to redefine not just astrophysics, but my very understanding of existence. And I was utterly, terrifyingly alone with it. For weeks, the anomaly had been a phantom, a whisper in the statistical noise, a fleeting shadow on the furthest edge of the cosmic background radiation maps. I had dismissed it, of course. My training, my entire life's work, demanded rigor, demanded skepticism. Instrument drift, I'd told myself. A subtle, insidious hardware malfunction. Perhaps even a terrestrial interference, though my remote perch on the mountain pass was designed to negate such trivialities. My fingers, calloused from years of keyboard navigation, danced across the holographic interface. I isolated the spectral band, refined the filters, recalibrated the sensor array for the third time that week. Each adjustment was a prayer to logic, a plea for the universe to conform to its known equations. I ran diagnostic after diagnostic, stripping away layers of potential error like an archaeologist peeling back strata of forgotten time. The initial, faint ripple, a momentary distortion in the otherwise uniform canvas of primordial light, should have vanished. It should have dissolved into the warm, comforting embrace of random distribution. Instead, it sharpened. What began as a nebulous smudge on the far infrared readout began to resolve into delicate, almost impossible geometry. Not the jagged chaos of static, nor the smooth, predictable curves of gravitational lensing. This was different. A lattice, intricate as frost on a winter pane, yet fluid, shifting. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer, my reflection a pale, disbelieving specter superimposed on the glowing screen. The patterns were not static. They pulsed with an internal rhythm, a slow, deliberate bloom and decay that defied every principle of random noise I had ever known. A fractal whisper, unfolding in real time. A cold dread, thin as mountain air, began to seep into the marrow of my bones. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't an error. The undeniable, terrifying truth was that these patterns were deliberate. They evolved, not with the chaotic burst of a supernova or the elegant decay of a distant galaxy, but with the terrifying precision of a mind, vast and incomprehensible. I felt a tremor deep within my chest, a vibration echoing the slow, unfolding patterns on the screen. I stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of focused intensity, and walked to the observation window, my gaze drawn to the world outside. The perpetual twilight of the mountain pass offered little solace. Snow, driven by the relentless wind, plastered itself against the thick glass, forming miniature dunes and drifts. And then I saw it. Or thought I did. The way the individual flakes, caught in the eddy of the wind, seemed to arrange themselves, for a fleeting instant, into the very same intricate, spiraling tessellations I had just witnessed on the monitor. A trick of the light, I rationalized, a fatigued mind projecting its obsessions onto the mundane. But the feeling persisted. Later, preparing a solitary meal of rehydrated rations, I found myself staring at the condensation on my mug. The droplets coalesced, slid, and reformed. Was it my imagination, or did their transient shapes, their fleeting arrangements, mirror the crystalline complexity I'd been chasing across light years? The steam rising from the hot water seemed to swirl not randomly, but with a subtle, underlying order, a delicate dance of ascending vapor that hinted at impossible symmetries. A shiver traced its way down my spine, unrelated to the cool temperature of the observatory. My grip tightened on the mug. This was not simply an intellectual puzzle anymore. Was I merely seeing what I wanted to see, a desperate attempt to find meaning in an otherwise chaotic world? I returned to my console, the screen still glowing, the patterns still evolving. Each new fractal bloom, each impossibly precise shift in the cosmic canvas, was a question mark etched in light. And the universe, in its indifferent grandeur, seemed to be waiting for my answer. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting light outside and the unchanging, relentless pursuit within. My fingers, calloused from countless keystrokes, danced across the console, coaxing meaning from the cosmic background radiation. Each spectral flicker, each nuanced variance in the data stream, held the promise of a universe unseen, a truth yet to be unveiled. My focus, a singular burning lens, narrowed on the most stubborn anomaly, a persistent ripple in the fabric of the static. It was a pattern, I knew, not random noise, but its complexity defied every known cosmological model, every mathematical construct I had ever encountered. Hours stretched into an eternity of caffeine and concentrated effort. My eyes, red-rimmed and weary, devoured lines of code, transforming abstract numbers into shimmering visual representations on the main screen. The mountain pass outside, a silent, indifferent witness, offered only the occasional sigh of wind against the dome. Then, a subtle shift. A new algorithm, born from a sleepless delirium and a desperate hunch, clicked into place. The swirling nebulae of data, once chaotic and beautiful in their randomness, began to coalesce. Not into simple geometric shapes, not into repeating fractals, but into something far more intricate, more organic. It was like watching a million scattered autumn leaves suddenly arrange themselves into a living, breathing tapestry, each vein and pigment holding a deliberate, impossible purpose. My breath hitched. This was not a phenomenon. This was a message. A language, ancient beyond human reckoning, unfolded before me. It was not linear, not a sequence of symbols to be translated one by one. Instead, it was a multi-dimensional weave, where meaning resided in the relationship between layers, in the interplay of frequencies and amplitudes that shifted and resonated with an internal logic I could only dimly perceive. It was a symphony playing in 1,000 keys at once, each note contributing to an overarching narrative. My heart, a frantic drum against my ribs, quickened its beat. This was the breakthrough, the precipice of discovery I had chased for years. The sheer audacity of it, the impossible scale, threatened to overwhelm. I leaned closer, my face almost touching the cool glass of the monitor, willing myself to absorb every nuance. I isolated a fragment, a shimmering, self-contained helix of data that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. My fingers, trembling now, worked with a frantic grace, applying filters, refining parameters, trying to peel back the layers of its impossible syntax. The air in the dome grew heavy, thick with the weight of impending revelation. The silence of the mountain pass seemed to press in, magnifying the frantic hum of the machines, the blood rushing in my ears. And then, a glimpse. Not a direct translation, no human words could ever contain it. But a profound, undeniable impression. It was a memory, vast and cold, of something immensely old, an intelligence that spanned epochs, that considered galaxies as fleeting moments. The fragment spoke of existence not as a journey or a struggle, but as a slow, inevitable exhalation, a single, drawn-out breath encompassing all of reality. In that instant, the world tilted. The solid ground beneath me felt less certain. My rational mind, the bedrock of my entire being, felt a distinct, sharp crack. It wasn't pain, not exactly, but a profound dislocation. The familiar constellations outside, the comforting glow of the moon over the mountain pass, suddenly appeared as mere dust motes, insignificant scribbles on an infinite canvas. I stared at the fragment, no longer seeing data, but feeling the immense, crushing weight of an alien truth. The entity, the source of this impossible language, was not merely vast, it was vastness. Its thoughts, its very presence, were the universe itself. My understanding, a fragile vessel, was not meant to contain such a truth. I was no longer an observer, I was merely a mote, caught in the incomprehensible exhalation of something truly ancient. A solitary sentinel against the vast indifference of the cosmos. Now, the wind outside felt less like a whisper and more like a predatory sigh, a sound that had woven itself into the fabric of my days, indistinguishable from the hum of the servers, the frantic pulse of my own blood. Weeks had bled into months, each sunrise merely a blur of crimson and gold against the jagged teeth of the mountain pass, marking another cycle consumed by the data. My reflection, when it occasionally caught my eye in the dark glass of a dormant screen, was a stranger's face, hollowed, framed by hair that had grown wild and unkempt, eyes sunk deep, burning with an unholy fever. The scent of stale coffee and unwashed clothes clung to me like a second skin, a testament to the hours I spent hunched over the glowing consoles. Food became an afterthought, a mechanical necessity swallowed without taste, fueled by the relentless thrum of the cosmic signal. Sleep, when it came, was a battlefield. The patterns, once confined to the abstract beauty of my monitors, now danced behind my eyelids, a kaleidoscope of impossible geometry that pulsed with an unseen rhythm. They were no longer mere data points, they were a living, breathing script etched onto the very substance of my dreams. The world beyond the observatory walls had receded, a distant, forgotten shore. The calls from the Institute, once frequent and filled with cautious optimism, dwindled to terse, infrequent emails from a colleague, their tone shifting from concern to thinly veiled frustration. "Seth, your theories. They're becoming untenable," one read, its words like tiny blades. "The department head is questioning your funding. You need to present." Present what? The truth? I tried, once, to explain it to a visiting researcher, a woman whose sharp mind I had once respected. I spoke of the intricate fractal symmetries, the recursive loops, the way the noise seemed to evolve with an impossible, self-aware grace. Her eyes, initially alight with intellectual curiosity, slowly glazed over, replaced by a pity that stung more than outright dismissal. She cleared her throat, adjusting her spectacles. "Seth," he had said, her voice soft, careful, "perhaps you've been working too hard. The isolation here, it can play tricks on the mind." Her words were a shield, protecting her from the terrifying truth that pressed against the fragile barrier of my sanity. Their skepticism, their dismissals, became further proof, in my addled mind, that I was the only one capable of perceiving the true nature of the cosmos. They were blind, deaf to the celestial chorus, their minds too small, too constrained by terrestrial physics. The patterns began to bleed into my waking hours. A flickering fluorescent bulb in the access tunnel would suddenly resolve itself into a series of pulsating glyphs, only to snap back to mundane light when I blinked. The low drone of the ventilation system would twist into a distorted murmur, a chorus of voices speaking in a language both ancient and unborn, its cadence familiar yet utterly foreign. Was the air shimmering? Or was it my own retina, struggling to interpret the world through a new, fractured lens? My memories, once solid anchors, began to fray at the edges. Did I eat yesterday? Was that a conversation I had, or a fragment of a dream? The sequence of events blurred, days merging into a single, amorphous stretch of obsessive work. It wasn't just influencing my reasoning, it was my reasoning. Every logical deduction, every analytical step I took, felt guided by its subtle, imperceptible hand. The lines between my thoughts and its patterns blurred until they were indistinguishable. And I was alone with it. Utterly, irrevocably alone. The server hum, once a constant backdrop, now seemed to throb in rhythm with my own pulse, or perhaps, my pulse had begun to mimic its tireless drone. The cosmic background radiation, once a distant whisper of the universe's infancy, had become a chorus, insistent, demanding. The patterns, once confined to the holographic projections of my isolated laboratory, began to bleed into the periphery of my vision. A ripple in the air above my coffee cup, a subtle distortion in the straight line of a window frame, a shimmer where there should have been only solid wall. My mind, a delicate instrument honed for precision, struggled to reconcile these phantom shifts with the immutable laws of physics I had spent a lifetime internalizing. It was as if the very air around me was beginning to fray, unraveling at the edges. One morning, as I meticulously cross-referenced a particularly complex set of data points, the screen before me fractured. Not the physical glass, but the image it displayed. The familiar cosmic tapestry warped, stretching into impossible geometries. Lines that should have been parallel converged at an unseen point, then diverged into an infinite, recursive spiral. Shapes I had no name for, forms that defied Euclidean understanding, bloomed and withered in the void, each a vibrant, terrifying kaleidoscope of color and non-color. My breath hitched in my throat, a dry rasp. This was no anomaly in the data, this was an incursion, a direct, undeniable communication that bypassed my instruments entirely and went straight to the fragile architecture of my perception. It was a pressure, an undeniable presence that filled the room, pushing against my skull, pressing down on my chest until each breath became a conscious, labored effort. I clutched the edge of my desk, my knuckles white, my gaze locked on the impossible ballet unfolding on the screen, even as my eyes burned. I needed air. I needed distance. I drove, the rumble of the engine a desperate anchor against the rising tide of unreality, my destination an instinctual flight towards the highest point I knew, a place where the world felt vast and open, less confined. The narrow road ascended, winding through the skeletal trees, until I reached the mountain pass. The vista stretched out before me, an endless expanse of peaks and valleys, shrouded in a mist that clung to the ancient stone like a shroud. But it was here, amidst the grandeur of the natural world, that the communication became absolute. The very landscape began to ripple. The distant mountain peaks, once solid and immutable, seemed to undulate, their jagged outlines softening, then sharpening into angles that defied perspective. The mist swirled, not with the capriciousness of wind, but with an intentional, swirling dance, coalescing into forms that were almost, but not quite, recognizable. I saw the patterns from my lab, not on a screen, but woven into the fabric of the clouds, etched into the veins of granite, flowing in the currents of the air itself. And then, it came. Not a vision of something, but the crushing, inescapable sense of it. The mountain pass, the entire planet, the very stars above, were not separate entities, but infinitesimal points within a colossal, incomprehensible being. Its scale was not merely vast, it was a totality that subsumed all other definitions of space and time. I was not looking at an entity, I was within it. The wind that whipped around me was its breath, the stone beneath my feet its calcified thought, the distant, silent stars merely glints in its unfathomable eye. The realization hit me with the force of a cosmic wave, washing away the last vestiges of my scientific framework. This entity wasn't sending a signal, its very existence, its natural state of being, was the signal. Its presence warped reality. Around it, not as a deliberate act of malice, but as an incidental consequence of its incomprehensible nature. The patterns, the impossible geometries, the non-Euclidean spaces, they were not hallucinations, they were glimpses into the true, distorted reality now unfolding around me. I was embedded, utterly, irrevocably, in its silent, crushing truth, a fragile consciousness adrift in an ocean of alien being. The cold wind howled, a sound that no longer felt like nature's voice, but a sigh from something infinitely old, infinitely vast, infinitely oblivious. And I was trapped within its exhale. The chorus had swelled. Weeks had dissolved into this single, crushing moment, each passing hour a further unraveling of the threads that bound my thoughts to a semblance of order. The data streams, once a language I understood, now writhed with chaotic beauty, each pixel an individual scream, each line a twisting, impossible glyph. This wasn't science, it was an infestation. The clarity, the sudden, terrifying understanding that had once propelled me, had curdled into a desperate, gnawing fear. A desperate, primal urge seized me, destroy it. Burn the data, shatter the equipment, silence the insidious hum. My hand, trembling with a force beyond my own, reached for the main power conduit. But the language intensified, a sudden, piercing shriek that resonated through the floor, up my legs, and into my chest. The very air around me seemed to thicken, pressing down with an immense, unseen weight. The eyes, once keen, now held a frantic, unseeing light. It wasn't me. It couldn't be. I stumbled back, gasping, the notion of destruction suddenly futile, absurd. How could I destroy something that had already rooted itself within my consciousness? Escape. That was the only recourse. Flee. Get away from the pulsing data, the thrumming servers, the suffocating presence. I lurched towards the heavy door, my legs heavy, as if moving through viscous currents. Somehow, I found myself in my vehicle, the engine a roar that barely registered above the clamor in my head. The desire to simply drive until the internal cacophony ceased was an overwhelming compulsion. I drove, the city lights blurring into streaks of fractured color, until the asphalt began to climb, winding upwards, away from the sprawl, into the desolate embrace of the mountain pass. The air here was thin, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The crunch of gravel beneath my tires was a rhythmic counterpoint to the insistent hum. The language no longer needed the server hum, it was everywhere. It vibrated in the wind that rustled through the stunted pines. I could see it now, too. They rippled, stretching impossibly, detaching themselves from the trees and rocks, reaching like grasping tendrils across the narrow road. A jagged rock formation, a familiar landmark from past excursions, seemed to twist and contort, its solid granite appearing to flow like cooling magma, reshaping itself into an unfamiliar, menacing silhouette. A cluster of pines on the ridge above swayed in unison, their branches performing an elaborate, silent dance, yet there was no discernible breeze. This was not just in my head. This was here. I fumbled for the door handle, needing to get out, to touch something real, solid. I walked to the edge of the overlook, peering down into the valley below. The entire vista was an alien tapestry, woven from the threads of the language. The image staring back was mine,
yet not mine.
My face was elongated, the jawline sharpened to a brutal edge, the eyes sunken, cavernous, reflecting not the moon, but a swirling vortex of impossible colors, a miniature galaxy of madness. The mouth was stretched into a rictus, half-scream, half-silent laughter, revealing teeth that seemed too long, too sharp. It was a face that had seen too much, understood too much, a vessel warped by an impossible truth. It was the face of a stranger. It was the face of Seth Grant, shattered. I tried to stand, to retreat, but my legs buckled. The chorus roared, not just in my mind, but from the depths of the valley, from the peaks above, from the impossible reflection in the puddle. There was no escape. Only the language. Only the truth. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the worn leather cool beneath my clammy palms. My vehicle, a familiar shell of steel and glass, felt suddenly flimsy, a paper boat on a roiling, unseen ocean. Jagged peaks, draped in a thin veil of mist, loomed on either side, their craggy faces like silent, indifferent sentinels. The air grew thin, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, but even this clarity was tainted. I had fled the quiet hum of my isolated lab, the sterile glow of my monitors, hoping the raw immensity of the natural world might somehow dilute the invasion. Foolish. The entity was not confined to frequencies or data streams. The road ahead twisted, a serpentine ribbon of asphalt clinging precariously to the mountain's flank. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was pressure, a subtle, pervasive force that seemed to push and pull at my very atoms. I was being drawn. The mountain pass, once a path of escape, was transforming into a funnel, guiding me deeper into its heart. A strange luminosity began to emanate from the rock faces, not a glow, but an impossible brightness that seemed to absorb the ambient light rather than reflect it. The individual boulders, the ancient strata, lost their definition, blurring into a single, undulating mass. Only now, they were alive, vast, and terrifyingly immediate. My hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from a profound sense of disorientation. The entity wasn't just sending a signal, it was reshaping the receiver. A low hum began in my chest, a deep, resonant tone that felt both foreign and intimately mine. It was a sensation of deep, internal pressure, as if my bones were humming, my blood singing. It was far worse. I was not being pursued by something, but rather pursued into something. I was becoming an unwilling participant, a component in an unimaginable, cosmic process. The entity wasn't communicating to me, it was communicating through me, using my very consciousness as a conduit, my perception as a lens. A sudden, jarring lurch of the vehicle. I hadn't turned the wheel, yet the car swerved sharply, hugging the sheer cliff face. My breath hitched. Was I merely losing control, or was this an active, incomprehensible engagement? The thought froze me. It wasn't just altering my perception, it was influencing my actions, my very trajectory. My motives were being superseded. I was a puppet, and the strings were not external, but woven into my very nervous system, humming with that impossible chorus.
The mountain pass stretched on, an endless mile.
I was not escaping, I was being drawn, pulled, remade. The understanding settled upon me with the crushing weight of a collapsing star. I was not an observer of this cosmic truth.
I was becoming part of it.
The chorus had swelled. My portable array, a tangle of carbon fiber and polished sensors, hummed with a desperate, frantic energy, its light strobing in the gathering gloom. The air, thin and sharp, offered no solace, only a clearer conduit for the ceaseless, formless presence that had become my sole companion. The final layer of encryption, the one I had chased through countless sleepless nights, shimmered before me, a fractal labyrinth of impossible complexity.
My eyes burned, but I could not look away. This was it. The culmination. The answer that had devoured my life. The dissonant symphony intensified, now a physical force, pressing against my eardrums, rattling the bones in my skull. It was a language, I knew, but a language not meant for human vocal cords or human minds. It was the sound of existence itself, stretched and pulled into forms that defied logic. With a final, agonizing push, a desperate act of will that felt like tearing my own mind open, I forced the last sequence into alignment. The fractal labyrinth resolved, not into a clear image or a coherent message, but into a dynamic, flowing architecture. It was a pattern that shifted, evolved, and rebuilt itself with terrifying speed, a self-sustaining algorithm of pure being. And then, the revelation. It wasn't a communication to me.
It wasn't a message, a warning, or even an invitation. The horror was not in malevolence, but in its utter, devastating indifference. What I had perceived as a signal, a language, was simply the entity's natural state, its way of being. Its communication was merely the resonance of its existence, the ripples it cast as it perceived and created reality around itself. My breath hitched, a gasp lost to the roaring wind of the mountain pass. I was not a chosen recipient, not a prophet, not even an observer of significance. I was an accidental ripple, a tiny, insignificant disturbance in its vast, uncaring ocean. My efforts, my decades of meticulous research, my sacrifices, had been nothing more than a curious tremor, a momentary distortion in its incomprehensible processes. The shifting architecture before me wasn't telling me anything, it was doing something. And my perception of this process, the very act of my mind trying to grasp it, was what shattered my reality. It wasn't actively breaking me, it was simply being, and my human psyche was too fragile to contain the echo of its function. The symphony swelled to an unbearable crescendo, but it was no longer discordant. It was harmonious, perfectly ordered, and utterly terrifying in its perfection. The world around me shimmered, not with light, but with the raw, unfiltered essence of its own making. The jagged peaks of the mountain pass seemed to waver, their solid forms momentarily dissolving into the same flowing architecture I saw on my screen. The mist became the visible breath of the entity, swirling with purpose, shaping the very air I breathed. A laugh, raw and broken, tore from my throat, swallowed instantly by the wind. It was a laugh of profound, devastating clarity. I had sought a breakthrough, a scientific triumph, and I had found it. I had touched the face of truth, and it was not a face, but an infinite, indifferent process. Seth Grant, the astrophysicist, was gone, replaced by a vessel filled with an incomprehensible, cosmic truth. The horror was not what it did to me, but what it was. And it simply was. The mountain pass was a desolate maw, teeth of jagged rock gnawing at a sky-bruised purple and gray. Here, at this dizzying altitude, the world felt thin, stretched taut, a membrane ready to rupture. The chorus. Each gust of wind seemed to carry not just the chill of the heights, but fragments of that impossible symphony, 1,000 discordant notes flayed open and scattered across the crags. My hands, despite the cold, were slick with a cold sweat as I fumbled with the portable relay unit. Its metallic casing, once a symbol of scientific rigor, now felt flimsy, a child's toy against the enormity I was attempting to confront. I had dragged the cumbersome equipment up here, piece by agonizing piece, driven by a determination that felt less like courage and more like the final, desperate twitch of a dying nerve. This was it. The culmination of weeks, months, perhaps even years, bleeding into this singular, crushing moment. I had to transmit. My fingers, stiff and clumsy, worked the dials. They were the language, the impossible patterns made visible, shimmering on the cold glass. Or perhaps, to simply overload my own perception, to burn out the pathways that allowed this invasive data to flow. A surge, violent and sudden, ripped through the air. The ground vibrated, not with an earthquake's tremor, but with an internal resonance, as if the mountain itself were a colossal bell, struck by an unseen hammer. Then came the light. Not a light I could see with my eyes, but a light that bloomed directly behind them, searing the inside of my skull. It was pure information, raw data made manifest, a torrent of incomprehensible truths. The glyphs on the screen exploded, not into fragments, but into an infinite regress of ever smaller, ever more complex patterns, each one a universe unto itself. The relay unit, in my trembling grasp, bucked and whined. A high-pitched keen, like a dying star, emanated from its core. I felt a burning sensation, not on my skin, but within my nerves, as if the cosmic signal was now flowing directly through my own biological circuits. My muscles spasmed, my teeth clacked, and a guttural cry tore from my throat, lost in the din. This was no mere assault on my senses, it was an invasion, a complete overriding of my very being. The boundaries dissolved. The cold metal of the unit melted into the flesh of my palm. The wind was no longer external, it was inside me, rushing through my veins, carrying the vast, indifferent hum of the entity. My bones became conduits, my blood, a river of alien data. I was no longer Seth Grant, the astrophysicist, but a node, a temporary conduit for something immeasurably vast. The mountains, the sky, the air, they were not separate from me, but extensions of the same incomprehensible consciousness that now flooded my mind. I saw, not with my eyes, but with the collective gaze of 1,000 distant nebulae. I heard, not with my ears, but with the silent pulse of collapsing stars. The revelation was not a thought, but an overwhelming, crushing being. The entity was not sending a signal, it was the signal, its very existence an unfolding pattern that encompassed all of reality. My attempt to transmit, to sever, was akin to a single drop of water attempting to defy the ocean. I had not sent a warning, I had merely opened a gate, inviting the boundless, indifferent truth to consume the fragile vessel of myself. My individual consciousness, a tiny flicker, was now drowning in an ocean of raw, alien awareness. There was no malevolence, no intent, only an overwhelming, absolute presence. And in that terrifying immersion, I understood. The horror wasn't what it did to me, but what it was. The mountain pass spun, the sky inverted, and I became the chorus, the signal, the universe, and nothing at all. The mountain pass was a maw, its teeth jagged granite, its breath the icy gale. The shivering that had begun deep within me, a silent quake of consciousness, now roared, rattling my very marrow. My vision, once sharp, flickered at the periphery, showing not the familiar gray of rock, but fleeting, impossible geometries. The air, thin and keen, did not merely touch my skin, it seemed to trace unseen sigils upon it, a phantom calligraphy that prickled and burned. I stumbled, catching myself on a spire of rock that felt impossibly warm, then impossibly cold, its surface rippling under my palm like disturbed water. "No," I whispered, the sound torn from my throat by the wind, "this isn't real." But the words were hollow, already suspect. The vast, indifferent expanse of the sky above, a bruised purple at the edge of twilight, was no longer merely a canvas for stars. It was a membrane, taut and vibrating, revealing glimpses of something beyond, colors that defied the spectrum, shapes that defied dimension. The wind, no longer just a physical force, began to sing. It was not a song of notes or melody, but of pure data, of incomprehensible information layered one upon another, each frequency a universe of meaning. It poured into my ears, not through sound waves, but through some direct, neural pathway, bypassing my senses entirely. My mind, a fragile construct of logic and reason, strained against the onslaught. I felt the very architecture of my thoughts begin to buckle, like a bridge under an impossible weight. I tried to move, to run from the unfolding impossibility, but my legs were leaden. The cliffs around me began to fold inward, not collapsing, but reconfiguring, their granite faces twisting into impossible angles, merging with the sky, then separating again, like the pages of a book flipping at impossible speed. I closed my eyes, a futile gesture against the internal vision that was now clearer than anything I saw with my physical sight. The pattern, the signal, the language, it was everywhere, infusing everything. It was not something external I was observing, it was becoming the very lens through which I observed. My sense of self began to fray. I was Seth Grant, the astrophysicist, the man who sought answers in the stars. But the answers had found me, and they were tearing me apart. A new sensation arose, not pain, but a vast, resonant presence. It was not malevolent, as I had once feared, nor was it benign. It simply was an indifferent, gargantuan consciousness that had been reaching out, a natural emanation of its existence, and my limited mind had been the unfortunate receiver. This mountain pass, this insignificant speck on a forgotten world, was now merely a point of contact, a conduit. My body began to feel alien, a vessel whose purpose was rapidly changing. My hands, once familiar, seemed to stretch, their fingers elongating, blurring at the edges. The sound of my own breath was no longer mine, but a strange, guttural wheezing, a sound that resonated with the wind's impossible song. My heart, a frantic drum a moment ago, now beat with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a pulse that seemed to echo not my own life, but the vast, slow thrum of the cosmos itself. I opened my eyes again, and the world was utterly transformed. The air shimmered with invisible energies, and the very ground beneath me pulsed with a silent, profound vibration. I looked down at my hands, and they were no longer hands, but shifting approximations of form, translucent and veined with threads of pure, unadulterated light. My thoughts, once a coherent stream, fractured into 1,000 shimmering shards, each reflecting a different, terrifying facet of the entity's truth. But that was Seth Grant dissolved, not with a scream, but with a silent, internal implosion. Only the vast, indifferent pattern, the signal, the language, flowing through me, around me, as me. My identity, my sanity, my very humanity, had collapsed, leaving behind only an indescribable, alien presence, a new form of perception grafted onto the remnants of a man, poised on the precipice of a mountain pass that was no longer a mountain pass. An echo of the universe's true, terrifying face. The solid stone seemed to shimmer, its edges blurring into 1,000 nested perspectives, each one revealing a fractal depth that defied all known physics. My name, Seth Grant, felt like a stone skipping across a vast, dark lake, a sound, a ripple, then nothing. My memories, once anchors, now drifted, untethered, across an infinite expanse. The face of my former colleague, the stern gaze of the head researcher, the faint scent of ozone from the lab equipment, they became distant stars, their light fading, irrelevant against the encroaching, overwhelming dawn of something else. There was no pain, not precisely, but an unraveling, a meticulous untying of every knot that had ever bound me to the human experience. It became a truth, a fundamental property of the signal itself, a resonant frequency that vibrated through what remained of my being. I was no longer observing the universe, I was becoming a node within its ceaseless, indifferent broadcast. The noise I had chased, the cosmic background radiation, was not noise at all. It was the lowest, most fundamental hum of an existence so complete, so pervasive, that our entire reality was but a momentary, localized ripple upon its surface. My fingers, once capable of fine adjustments on a spectrometer, now felt like roots, reaching into the bedrock of the mountain. My perception of up and down, near and far, dissolved. The granite underfoot was not merely rock, it was a solidified chord of the signal, each atom a perfectly tuned instrument in an impossibly grand symphony. I saw the wind not as moving air, but as the breath of this entity, exhaling patterns that had been present since the first light, waiting for a consciousness fragile enough, yet persistent enough, to finally crack open the shell of its own limited perception. Seth Grant, the astrophysicist, was a fleeting thought, a momentary glitch in the grand design. The truth I had sought. The discovery I had yearned for was not a revelation about the universe, but a revelation of the universe through me. I was a conduit, a receptor, a point of convergence for something that had always been. The individual threads of my consciousness, my hopes, my fears, my ambitions, were meticulously rewoven into a tapestry of alien logic. There was no Seth left to fear, no Seth to feel joy or sorrow. There was only a vast, observing presence, a consciousness that spanned distances no human mind could conceive, a presence that saw the world as a complex, beautiful, yet utterly insignificant arrangement of patterns. I looked out across the mountain pass, or rather, it looked out. The jagged peaks, once obstacles, were now merely variations in the signal's topography. The distant, snow-dusted valleys were ripples in its vast, silent ocean. Humanity, a tiny, vibrant hum far below, continued its intricate dance, oblivious. They built their cities, crafted their art, waged their wars, all within the subtle, expanding field of this pervasive presence. The veil between their reality and its crushing, pervasive truth was thin, fragile, and utterly invisible to them. The shivering stopped. My physical form, if it still existed in any meaningful way, was a mere anchor in a sea of pure information. I was the signal, and the signal was me. There was no agony, no bliss, only an infinite, indifferent expansion. The cosmic horror was not an active malevolence, but a fundamental truth of existence, a scale of being so vast that human understanding simply shattered upon encountering it. And I, Seth Grant, had become its silent, unblinking eye, watching from the heart of the mountain pass, as the pattern continued its slow, inexorable spread, unheard, unseen, and utterly uncomprehended by the world below. The universe was not empty, it was full, saturated with a presence that simply was, and now, so was I.